Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We know that people are just coming into the room, but we'd like to get started. So please settle in. I want to welcome you to OCIC's Global Citizens Forum 2022 and to thank you for joining us for the first of 6 virtual sessions that we're offering today and tomorrow in partnership and collaboration with many esteemed colleagues, members, and partners from across Canada and around the world. Today's first session will be conducted in English with simultaneous French translation. If you would like to listen in French, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select the French channel. If you want to listen in English, you can select the English channel or you can just leave the interpretation off. So please note that closed captioning is available and can be accessed by clicking on the live transcript show subtitle link at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so that's some of the technical things. My name is Kimberly Gibbons, and I have the privilege of acting as the Executive Director of OCIC. On behalf of our team, I want to begin by recognizing that we are many diverse peoples attending this forum from many different locations and unceded territories. Personally, I acknowledge that I'm joining today from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, which comes from the Haudenosaunee word Takaronto, is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be here. As we increasingly learn to reflect on our role within a settler colonial context, I acknowledge the importance of naming the Indigenous communities on whose lands we live, work, and play, and I acknowledge the importance of framing our involvement and engagement in our sector and beyond through the lens of reconciliation. So in this forum, we are committed to creating a safe and inclusive space, and we ask that all participants commit to the code of conduct that we have that's been inspired by the Intercouncil Network and Amnesty Canada and shared with you in the chat here and perhaps in the registration links. The code of conduct outlines our shared commitment towards respect, inclusion, humility, safety, solidarity, patience, and openness for all participants and all collaborators. And so we want to advise, if you do experience anything in conflict with this code of conduct during the forum, please do not engage directly, but you can reach out to the OCIC team and we will communicate with the person. This session has been recorded to enable us to share highlights with you in the coming few days. And throughout the session, you can feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function. This forum is being undertaken with the financial support of the Government of Canada through Global Affairs Canada. And I just want to recognize and really warmly thank all of our colleagues within GAC for their institutional support and their partnership with us in this and all of our upcoming International Development Week initiatives. This forum seeks to build awareness and share understanding of localization agenda and its broader objectives towards shifting power. It also seeks to highlight the roles and perspectives of many diverse stakeholders in this agenda and to share related research, tools, and good practices within the international cooperation sector and with interested Canadians and global partners. So you might be wondering why this, why localization? There are many reasons for this focus, and these are going to be elaborated much better than I could by our panelists today and throughout the forum. But to put it simply, a localized approach to international cooperation is absolutely necessary for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, insofar as localizing the SDGs means taking the individual subnational context into account. So we recognize that the SDGs are global, but their implementation and overall success relies on sustainable local implementation. In their 2021 report, Catalyzing Locally Led Development in the UK Aid System, Bond supports a definition of locally led development, as initiatives owned and led by people in their own context. They identify sustainability, the recognition of power dynamics, and diversity and plurality as some of the main principles and assumptions underlying localization. In the context of the global pandemic, it has never been more clear why and how locally led development power sharing, and decolonization is critical to sustainability. Bond also identifies numerous barriers to localization, such as the role of donors as agenda setters, colonial mindsets, organizational culture, harmful stereotypes, and narratives of local incapacity. Localization itself has received criticism from communities worldwide due to some INGOs making public commitments, but ultimately failing to deliver. In Canada, various CSOs are taking steps towards institutional, behavioral, and regulatory changes needed for localization. And as part of these efforts, we recently undertook a context analysis of our own members' websites. We found that while many organizations describe their efforts as working with local partners or supporting grassroots, locally driven work, community-led initiatives, most do not use the words localization. In November, we conducted a member-led idea jam focused on understanding where our sector is at and identifying capacity building needs in this area. And participants indicated interest in advocacy related to this topic, in increasing dialogue between Global North and Global South actors, and in working with other small and medium-sized organizations in Canada to come to a nationally recognized definition and principles of localization. They also raised questions like, how do we recognize and address the burdens imposed by localization? How is localization part and parcel of a feminist agenda? What does local even mean? And how are localization and decolonization related? So finally, there's a lot of significance to this agenda, and there's many diverse views and challenges and questions that it's raising. So we have prioritized this topic in a number of ways through different capacity building workshops, through this forum itself, and through our Tapestry 2030 podcast and illustration series that will focus on this topic. So over the next few days, we look forward to hearing from 26 sector leaders and practitioners, experts and advocates, academics and funders, and youth from 9 countries. And to get us started today, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our moderator and facilitator, Brian Tomlinson. Brian Tomlinson is the Executive Director of AidWatch Canada and an adjunct professor at the Department of International Development Studies at Dalhousie University. Much of his work focuses on issues related to Canadian and global aid priorities, as well as global trends in the development effectiveness of civil society organizations. Brian has had a long career working with international CSOs, and in June 2011, he retired as Senior Policy Analyst at the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, where he worked for 16 years. He's widely published on Canadian development cooperation and closely follows trends and issues related to Canadian international climate finance. We are so pleased that he agreed to develop and moderate this opening panel. And so warm welcome to Brian, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Kimberly. And it's a very great pleasure to be back working with OCIC. And as you will recall, and maybe members on this call will recall, that we did some interesting work together on some of these topics a number of years ago relating to the Istanbul principles for CSO development effectiveness. So there's a lot of continuity here in hosting this this webinar. And thanks to the participants for joining. I know that this is maybe a bit of an obscure topic, and so I really appreciate OCIC taking the risk to launch their series of webinars with their annual conference with the topic being this legal instrument, essentially, which we'll explain in a few minutes, the DAC Recommendation on Enabling Civil Society and Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Assistance, a long title. But my hope is that by the end of this session, you will have had a chance not only to understand the content of this recommendation and why it is relevant to this broad agenda of localization that Kimberly just discussed and is central to your work over the next number of months, but also the potential for this framework and as a tool for all of us to advance donor policies and practices that can help protect civic space and enable civil society yourselves to be effective development actors. These are very important conditions or preconditions in my mind that really speak to some of the challenges and dilemmas that we all face in looking at the localization agenda. And to help us do that, we have a very excellent panel, 4 panelists who will speak in a few minutes, and I'll introduce them in a few minutes. But first, I wanted to give just a few introductory remarks to kind of situate the recommendation and why we're discussing this. So I don't think for many there's a need to remind us about the issues confronting civil society around the world. We daily hear about and witness continued attacks on human rights defenders, women rights activists, indigenous peoples and their organizations, protectors of the environment, the sustained community. We know that civic space is very contested, and none more so in increasing authoritarian countries during this time, these past 2 years of the pandemic. So it's a core preoccupation, I think, for many civil society around the world. According to Civicus, which is a global platform that monitors civic space in 197 countries, more than 70% of populations of these countries live under conditions which they describe as either repressive or completely closed to civil society. That's a very stark reminder about the conditions in which many of our colleagues across the Global South are working. Civil society in the Global South, though, are standing their ground, but they're often facing very unique challenges. Many of them are small and medium-sized organizations, not unlike many of the members of OCIC. Some of them face some of the same challenges. And for many years in Canada, we have had a strong civil society representation that defends the independence of civil society as actors, as we call it, in our own right. And we defend the right to initiative, which is our right as representatives of citizens and their organizations to put forward development alternatives and to promote those with colleagues and partners across the world. But it's also true over these years, as Kimberly has kind of hinted, that in the Global South, they're raising still many questions about the nature of these partnerships and whether they themselves have the right to initiative, with the space for local leadership and defining appropriate development initiatives in their own country. And this panel will address some of these issues. I very much welcome the work that OCIC is doing on the localization agenda. As Kimberly has said, it's an occasion again to examine our own practices as civil society organizations, looking at new forms of collaboration for policy impact, for development impact, new forms of financing perhaps, north-south relations between civil society. This is a huge and complicated agenda, but one that is essential for advancing our shared goals, as Kimberly said, around the SDGs and eradicating poverty. But change in these areas clearly requires an enabling policy and government regulations that govern the ways in which CSOs, at least those that are related to the international cooperation regime, can relate to each other. And this is where the DAC recommendation enabling civil society is groundbreaking. It is the first legal instrument that establishes international standards for donor practice that enable civil society and to which donors can be held accountable. And we'll hear more about that in the panel and in the subsequent question and answer to follow. But it's important to just stress that these are international standards. This is not another policy statement. It's setting new ground here. So just quickly to give a bit of background for those who may not be as familiar with the OECD and the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee. The origins of the OECD is, as often called, the Club of the Rich. That was created in 1961. And it has been, Canada has been a part of the OECD since that time. And it is a body that establishes best practice, collects statistics, and sets common standards in key areas of social and economic policy of its members. And the Development Assistance Committee was created at the same time. And it was created to coordinate development efforts among its members. Now it has 30 members. Back then in 1961, it had far fewer. But it has done important work, often in the background for many of us, but important work in setting the framework for the ways in which development cooperation is practiced. So it establishes the rules about what is counted as ODA, official development assistance, and holds donors to account to those rules in the reporting of their ODA. It provides a forum for discussing best practices in development cooperation, such as gender equality, engaging the private sector, environmental sustainability. It sometimes codifies these best practices in what is called DAC recommendations, legal instruments. And lastly, and very importantly, it conducts substantial periodic peer reviews of all of its members, holding each other accountable to the standards of best practice. Canada is represented at the DAC with a permanent delegation and ambassador, and participates in all of the processes of the DAC and its subsidiary bodies. It's also important to note that the DAC works by consensus, so it's a political body. So the outcomes of the DAC, such as this recommendation, were negotiated. They're not just the best thoughts of those who tried to put forward the recommendation. They had to be negotiated with those who perhaps had different views on the enabling of civil society. So it is a compromise, and we need to acknowledge that. So the DAC also has been, therefore, an important space for civil society organizations concerned about the quality of ODA, both in Canada, but also in other donor countries. And for a long time, I myself have been involved in advocacy at the DAC, first through what's called the Reality of Aid project, a global project led by from the Global South, from Yvonne in the Philippines, but more lately from a reference group, which brings together about 100 CSOs from around the world, from both the Global South and Global North, who have a permanent engagement now with the DAC and its subsidiary bodies on these areas that I mentioned above. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there's been a lot of progress in this engagement. It's much more systematic now. We have much better access to dialogue with relevant bodies within the DAC. So why this focus on the DAC, this DAC recommendation? So different from, as I've said, other DAC assessments of good practice to inform donor ways of working, and despite its name, a recommendation is a strong legal instrument. While not legally binding on donors as international law, when agreeing to a recommendation, DAC members accord these legal instruments, quote, great moral force as representing the political will of the adherents, who therefore commit to do their utmost to fully implement a recommendation. That's text taken from the OECD's own interpretation of what it means to adhere to a recommendation. So these are taken very seriously by the DAC, as we will hear shortly. Maximum effort is made to promote their implementation. So this is what this webinar is in part about. It's about building knowledge about this recommendation, but also finding ways that we as civil society can take advantage of it. So the recommendation was only just agreed in July of the past year, July 2021. So it's still very early days in its implementation. But it's not just a document. This document actually is the results of probably 15 years of work on the part of civil society organizations, but also a few DAC donors, members who have championed the principles for effectiveness and action to enable civil society. So there have also been champions of this agenda, and in the past, Canada has been very much part of those champions. So in leading up to this recommendation, the DAC Secretariat, which is called the Development Cooperation Directorate, led a policy process with DAC members to document their current practices and challenges. And all of these background papers are available for those who are interested. But the important point to say here is that they too were the subject of fairly intense consultations with civil society, both at the DAC in terms of these processes at the DAC in Paris, but also in some donor countries such as Sweden. And the recommendation, as I said, is the political outcome of this process and negotiated among those who are both champions, but also those who may have been more reluctant in their relationships with civil society organizations as development actors. So with this bit of background, I want to turn to the panel, and hopefully the panel will unpack the recommendation from several vantage points. I also just want to say that this is new for a lot of us, including myself several years ago, although I'm much more familiar with it now, of course. But, and so I urge people to ask questions in the question box. No question is a stupid question. There's only stupid answers. So, we need to understand this. So feel free to ask the questions that occur to you. So without further ado, I want to briefly introduce the panelists who will be speaking for about 10 minutes, and then I'll follow up with a follow-up question that has actually been prearranged with the panelists so they could prepare. Our first panelist is Marilyn Bachman, and she will provide an overview of the context of the recommendation and the intentions of the DAC to promote its, the content of the recommendation and the intentions of the DAC to promote its implementation. Marilyn is a policy analyst with the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, the Secretariat for the DAC, with decades of experience in the areas of development cooperation, democratic governance, and civil society. And I should just note that I'm hoping that the full bios of all 4 participants can be put in the chat so that you can see them in more detail if you're interested. Marilyn will be followed by Anabel Cruz, a civil society activist originally from Uruguay, a founding director of the Institute for Communication and Development in that country, as well as a regional CSO, Rendir Cuentas, a civil society accountability initiative with partners in 12 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. She's played a very strong role over many years in global civil society, twice serving as chair of the board of Civicus, which I mentioned earlier, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation. And she will be followed by a colleague from Global Affairs Canada, Susan Perzerzov, sorry, I knew I'd butcher your name. She is the director of the Global Citizens and Engagement Division at Global Affairs Canada. She also has had a rich career in international development, serving in bilateral programs in Africa and the Americas, with multiple postings across the world. And finally, but not least, we're very pleased to be able to hear from our colleague from the Philippines, Carmen Zubiaga. She brings to this panel a perspective informed by the experience of civil society activism through grassroots organizations in the Philippines. Carmen is a disability rights advocate and is currently Executive Director of Women with Disabilities Leap to Social and Economic Progress, an organization of and for women with disabilities. She has had a wide career with various institutions, including the UNDP in Cambodia, but also with the Office of the Mayor of her hometown, Tai Rizal. So without any more from me, let's hear from the panelists and launch into our discussion. So over to you, Marilyn.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you for this comprehensive introduction and the overview of the DAC and the DCD, the Development Cooperation Directorate, as well as the recommendation. Greetings to all participants, as well as my fellow panelists, Susan, Anabel, and Carmen. It's a pleasure to be part of the opening panel of OCIC's 2022 Global Citizens Forum on Localization Matters. A special thanks to OCIC for bringing us together around this important topic, particularly Kimberly and Elizabeth. Unfortunately, Jacqueline Wood, who is the civil society team lead at the OECD DCD, could not join today, but she does send her regards. And so I'll be sharing some of the highlights of the recommendation on behalf of our OECD team. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. Great, that I see that is just being put up. If we could please move to the next slide. Thank you. So the new DAC recommendation on enabling civil society in development cooperation and humanitarian assistance was adopted by the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the DAC, on the 6th of July of last year. Next slide, please. The recommendation is about doing more to help enable civil society to maximize civil society's contributions to the 2030 Agenda, inclusive sustainable development and democracy. Could move to the next slide, please. So what's new with the recommendation? And as Brian pointed out, this is the first international standard by development cooperation and humanitarian assistance providers addressing specifically the issue of enabling civil society. The other new aspect of the recommendation is that it addresses together the three interlinked pillars about how DAC members can first better respect, protect, and promote civic space. Second, better support and engage with civil society. And third, better incentivize CSO effectiveness, transparency, and accountability. So you may be wondering why there is a focus on these three specific pillars. In our OECD evidence gathering process, including a 2020 study on DAC members in civil society, but also a foresight policy paper on the topic of digital transformation and the futures of civic space, two things became very clear. The first being that there are worrying trends in the areas covered by the three pillars, namely growing restrictions on civic space, the fact that DAC members are not always providing their support to civil society in the most effective manner, and also shortcomings in civil society's own effectiveness in achieving results and in upholding accountability to their varied stakeholders. It also became evident that these three challenges are very much interlinked, that they affect each other, and in this way that they couldn't be addressed in isolation from each other. Next slide, please. So what does an OECD DAC recommendation mean and why is it important? The recommendation provides a common framework or a standard for DAC members, as well as for others that may wish to adhere to the recommendation. It has a global reach, so other providers of development cooperation beyond the DAC, as well as intergovernmental organizations, can also adhere to the recommendation. And in this regard, we welcome your support in disseminating the recommendation and encouraging adherence beyond the DAC. So on the point of dissemination, it is also a requirement that is built into the recommendation, and so is monitoring. This has implications when it comes to holding DAC members and other adherents accountable for the progress of the recommendation's implementation. And finally, on this point, while the OECD legal instruments such as recommendations are considered soft law, meaning that they're not legally binding, the recommendation still represents a political commitment with a great moral force, representing a political will of adherence, as pointed out by Brian. So I'll now provide a quick overview of each pillar and point to some examples of provisions. Moving on to the next slide. Perfect, thanks. So the first pillar is about respecting, protecting, and promoting civic space. For example, it includes provisions calling on providers to develop clear policy positions on the value of an inclusive and independent civil society and on the importance of civic space. It also calls on providers to engage in dialogue with governments in partner countries around these issues and to work with them on this front. Providers are also called on to apply the do no harm principle when it comes to civic space. In other words, to be coherent in their policies and programs so that their support does not have unintended negative consequences on civic space. For example, possibly through support for private sector investment in mining. Next slide, please. So on to the second pillar, this one is about supporting and engaging with civil society in a more effective manner. As an example, one of the provisions calls on providers to provide flexible and predictable support and specifically mentions core or program-based support. So this is about trying to get providers to move away from short-term project-based funding for CSOs that so often is designed to meet providers' priorities and is not necessarily grounded in CSOs' priorities. Other provisions in this pillar touch on streamlining administrative requirements for civil society support to lower transaction costs for civil society and providers, incorporating adaptive and flexible processes into results management of civil society funding. There are also provisions in this pillar that call on providers to work with civil society actors to respect DAC and other international standards, for example, related to the humanitarian development peace nexus and the ending sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. On to the next slide, please. So the third pillar, this pillar includes provisions which calls on DAC members and adherents to support and work with CSOs on their effectiveness, transparency, and accountability, such as CSO accountability to their constituents and beneficiaries in partner countries. Effectiveness, transparency, and accountability of CSOs is a critical goal on its own right. It's also an important way to help bolster positive perceptions of CSOs, which can serve as a counterweight to the tendency to shrink civic space. For example, the provisions call on adherents to build on good practices for CSO-led self-regulation and to support CSOs to meet relevant human rights standards in their activities and organizations. Next slide, please. Next steps. So the adoption of the recommendation is actually only the starting point of the change process. The real work begins now to ensure that the political commitments laid out in the recommendation are actually translated into practice with tangible and concrete changes in development cooperation policies and practices that better contribute to enabling civil society. Going forward, 3 priorities will guide next steps. The first priority is the dissemination of the recommendation to sustain political momentum and commitment among DAC members, as well as to expand adherence to other providers of development cooperation and to intergovernmental organizations. The second priority is to support adherence in implementing the recommendation. And this will be done by facilitating learning, adaptation, and exchanges that build an understanding of what the recommendation means in practice for adherents and also their ability to implement it. This will involve the development of toolkits to support implementation. The third priority is monitoring progress of the recommendations implementation. And to do this, we will be leveraging existing OECD DAC data and processes to gather information on adherence experiences, for instance, through the DAC peer review mechanism. When it comes to the issue of localization, there are a number of provisions in the recommendation that can help advance this agenda by promoting a shift in power and resources to local CSOs. So just to share a few examples of provisions before closing, some of the provisions specifically calls on providers to establish in consultation with civil society policies or strategies that aim to strengthen local ownership and an inclusive and independent civil society in partner countries, but also to promote and invest in the leadership of local civil society actors through funding mechanisms by increasing the availability and accessibility of direct, flexible, and predictable support, including core and program-based support to enhance the financial independence, sustainability, and local ownership of local CSOs, and also by supporting civil society strategic alliances, networks, platforms, and resource centers at the national and subnational levels. There's also a specific provision that calls on providers to ensure local civil society actors are involved in decision-making process, including throughout the design, budget, and implementation processes of programming. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I hope that this helped provide an overview of the recommendation. I'm happy to respond to questions in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marilyn. That was an excellent overview of the recommendation and importantly, ways in which it's going to be carried forward. I think, you've highlighted some key areas of the recommendation, but I would urge everybody, if you're interested in pursuing this more, to actually read the recommendation. It's a very short document, it's about 5-6 pages at most, but it does really address many of the key areas that have long preoccupied civil society for many years. And importantly, it also does address our responsibility as civil society organizations to work on our own development effectiveness. Not as a directive, but it's put in language that donors have an obligation to support us in that work and accompany us in that work. So that, to me, also is a key part of the pillars of this recommendation. And that's a good lead in to our next speaker, Anabel Cruz. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you so much to the Ontario Council for International Cooperation for this invitation. Really delighted to be here with such distinguished panel in this so important topic for civil society organizations in Latin America, where I am now and where I am from, and for civil society organizations and development cooperation around the world. I really think that the DAC recommendation is a very important step and a tool that we all have to use in advocacy, in our practices, in our work. I was listening to Marilyn's comprehensive presentation, and I was thinking that if all the actors in development cooperation and humanitarian assistance bring just a little bit, as we say in Spanish, un granito de arena in all the topics, that it should be a dream come true. I mean, in terms of equality, equity, solidarity between and among partners. So this is an important advocacy tool. I see it as more as a political document than as a legal document. And I think Marilyn also pointed out that part. And the recommendation is based on the three pillars are very much interconnected, because there cannot be an open civic space without effective civil society organization, or many of the provisions, you can see they are very much interconnected. But probably because of my bias, I have been working in effectiveness, transparency, and accountability of civil society. I wanted to touch the third pillar, promoting civil society organizations' effectiveness, transparency, and accountability. I think that one central question is how donors, development partners in the field, international organizations, we civil society in the north, our partners in we civil society in the south and our partners in the north, everywhere. How can we follow in practice this recommendation and specifically put into effect this pillar? I think that at the core of this recommendation is really a shared belief about the importance of a strong, independent, accountable, and diverse civil society. This is valid for donor countries, for partner countries, for territories to which development cooperation flows. And in this context, accountability is not an end in itself. It's a way to strengthen organization. It's also a way to protect organization in a shrinking civic space, and also, of course, to generate legitimacy. This pillar, as Marilyn announced, has some provision and has a total of 8 provisions. All are very relevant and all are interconnected. Some provisions speak also to the necessary power shift in international cooperation. But I wanted to mention 2 calls for action that this pillar and this of the provisions that. The first provision, let me read it, calls to support voluntary CSO efforts to build on existing good practice and standards in CSO-led self-regulation, transparency, and accountability mechanisms to broaden civil society organizations' participation in such mechanisms. This tells us, and I think it's very important, that civil society organization transparency and accountability is not about external sophisticated certification processes or quality seals. And it is not about the fear about civil society organizations' corruption. It's different. It's a call to build systems of trust. And it's not about to reinvent the wheel, but as I said, to build on existing good practices. It's a recognition that there is, and there are in many countries and around the world, good practices that should be supported and build up on those. So to build trust and to strengthen civil society participation in those already existing mechanisms is a very important call in this provision. Furthermore, there is another provision that calls and that speaks that civil society organizations need support to implement mutual capacity building actions to address the problems their vulnerabilities, and to reinforce resilience, accountability, effectiveness. So I feel that to promote, to disseminate this recommendation is very important. And each of us can have concrete actions that we can promote governments, donors, civil society organizations at global level in our own countries, networks in the North and in the South. So all actors involved can work together to strengthen the capacities of civil society organizations. On the first hand, I think that transparency and accountability should be a transversal component in international cooperation, in all programs and in international grants, but not taken as the due diligence document that many organizations and the check mark that we have to fulfill, but in terms of accountability to our missions, to our results, and to our stakeholders, to the so-called beneficiaries and primary constituencies that we work with. This also has to be based on our own development practice, our own existing practices. So based on this, on existing practices, it is very important to pay attention to practices and standards that have been developed by civil society for civil society. And of course, the Istanbul Principles and the global standard for CSO accountability appear as very relevant and important. These two standards are already also mentioned in the background information of the recommendation. The global standard for CSO accountability has indeed paid attention to the Istanbul Principles, to the core humanitarian standard. It is a reference standard. It is an existing good practice that civil society organizations from around the world can adopt, can adapt, and can implement to strengthen their own accountability practices. The global standard uses 12 commitments, and it's tried to capture a shared understanding from CSO accountability from around the world, and it embodies another concept of accountability, not vertical, not only financial accountability, but a dynamic approach to accountability, with organizations engaging in dialogues with their stakeholders. So the global standard really focuses on putting people at the center of the decision-making processes. And I was thinking that this is also a way of talking about localization. This can be a starting point that can help the civil society sector to become more resilient, more participative, more responsive, and of course, generating trust on the ground, on leveraging stakeholders' contributions to a greater impact. So it is very important that civil society organizations can receive support from different and in different manners and from different actors to improve our own self-regulation processes. Donors, governments in the North, in the South, should pay attention to these existing practices and start dialogue with trying to support this different CSO-led mechanism. I think that the important part of promoting and that disseminating this recommendation is crucial, It's wonderful that being approved in July after many years of work, indeed, because it concentrates the aspiration and the work and the advocacy work of many, many years. Since July, I have been really have the privilege of being in at least 3 debates about this. And I hope that the work in countries and in localized work and at global level will continue this new year. So thank you, Brian, again, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anabel. That was such a rich presentation. It's impossible to summarize it as your facilitator host here, but you really did, I think, articulate very clearly the centrality of accountability in our work, the importance of trust in our relationships, and the essential need for donors to recognize that their practices themselves influence the ways in which structures of accountability can be realized with civil society, particularly in the Global South, but also in the Global North. I just point to Canadian Council of International Cooperation, which became Cooperation Canada, and its Code of Ethics, still a very strong document, but because of changes in funding relationships going back a decade, it's been very difficult to keep up the momentum with that Code of Ethics. So I think these are very pertinent comments, and I think point to some of the potential of this recommendation to push this agenda forward. So I now want to turn to Susan from Global Affairs Canada and welcome her comments on the recommendation. So over to you, Susan.
Thanks very much, Brian. And first off, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people in Ottawa here, in the Ottawa region. And I'm honored to participate in this event organized by OCIC, who's an important partner really for Global Affairs Canada on inspiring action and engaging Canadians as global citizens and raising awareness and discussion and interest in international development and global issues. And I'm very happy to be here alongside distinguished panelists who I've seen now in at least one other event, some of us. I think this conversation is advancing, and it's great to see the sharing of different perspectives and to contribute some views, some perspectives from my place here in Global Affairs Canada. But I can't go further without noting that this is taking place in the lead up to International Development Week. And this is a flagship event and very important moment in the year when Global Affairs Canada and international and partners across the country take a moment to celebrate the contributions that Canadians are making to international development to contribute to a more inclusive, peaceful and prosperous world. And so a big congratulations to all those that are engaged in this process right now. It's an exciting time, and I thank you for all of the amazing work that you do. But today, really, I'm here to also share some reflections on the DAC recommendation that Brian and Marilyn and Anabel have already spoken to, and a little bit how it fits within our approach to partnerships with civil society organizations in international development. Civil society is absolutely central. It's key to making international cooperation a reality. It's central in our thinking and in our approach to delivering international assistance. Partnering with civil society in projects and programs and engaging in dialogue on policy issues allows Canada to leverage Canadian and also local expertise, resources, and innovation, and to strengthen the efficiency and effectiveness of our international assistance. CSOs help raise Canada's awareness, Canadians' awareness, support, and action related to international assistance. It's a multifaceted kind of relationship and partnership that has been built over the years and continues to be a very central component of our international assistance programming. And the pandemic, which we are still living, has been and is a stark reminder that development impact is achieved through a multitude of voices and actors, and especially the voices and actors and the hands of local communities in the countries in which we work around the world. So the Canadian approach is anchored in the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which has a strong intersectional and human rights-based approach. And it requires that all development initiatives be anchored in real engagement with the local communities. And the human rights-based approach provides a lot of guidance on how to do that and what that means. And so the policy challenges us to support local ownership, to streamline delivery of international assistance in accordance with principles of aid effectiveness, including transparency and accountability and financial stewardship. And we support this need to foster transparency and accountability for better policies and better program delivery. What complements this is also our policy on civil society partnerships for international assistance. And it's a policy that was drafted in 2015 and then updated in 2017 once the Feminist International Assistance Policy came into place. And it's underpinned by this feminist and human rights-based approach that recognizes also the Istanbul principles for CSO development effectiveness. A couple of years ago, to make this policy or this policy framework more action-oriented, I guess, or more concrete, an implementation plan was developed, co-developed, in fact, with Canadian civil society organizations to ensure that we captured the mutual priorities and commitment from both government and civil society. So this action plan lists commitments on promoting gender equality, fostering innovation, engaging Canadians, nurturing multi-stakeholder partnerships, facilitating a safe and enabling environment for civil society, integrating the role of CSOs as independent actors into international assistance programming through dialogue, promoting more predictable, equitable, and flexible and transparent funding mechanisms, among other things. And this implementation plan is actually quite unique. Not all policies have a co-developed implementation plan, but it's something that we're actually very proud of. And it allows us to track progress. It provides fairly concrete guidance for how we can advance, and it can be complemented or supported by specific dialogue platforms or other initiatives and exercises that take these commitments one step further. And so this policy and this approach that we have already adopted and have been working very hard to implement over the past several years has actually put us in a good position to engage and to work towards the DAC recommendation on enabling civil society in development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. The recommendation, as we've heard from other panelists, contains very, very specific commitments and objectives in terms of safeguarding civic space, enabling civic space, about how we engage with civil society partners, and how we incentivize effectiveness, efficiency, transparency, and accountability within our CSO partner communities. The recommendation really reaffirms Canada's commitment to respecting to these three key pillars of enabling civil society. And we engage closely with other countries to exchange best practices to see how best to move this forward. Dissemination is a critical component. Supporting the implementation and the rollout of the recommendation through toolkits is an important component, and of course, monitoring is another important part of that. But as Brian has said, we are learning, right? And it's important for us to continue to discuss and to share our experiences in the Community of Democracies Working Group within the OECD, within the OECD DAC Community of Practice on Civil Society, and other platforms. These are important spaces for ongoing dialogue. And these formal policy dialogue structures enable civil society also to contribute valuable knowledge and expertise to addressing local development challenges and engaging the poorest, the most vulnerable, and the most marginalized. So Canada continues to demonstrate, our commitment through our own roundtables and dialogue structures in Canada. Here we have a CSO Global Affairs Canada annual consultation or annual dialogue. Sorry, we have a series of roundtables and task forces that address specific issues related either to financial issues related to the implementation of the CSO policy, as I'd mentioned, or related to other strategic issues. Collaboration with CSOs on the establishment of different programs and projects is another way that we can bring the policies like the CSO policy and recommendations like the DAC recommendation to bear fruit and bring it into action. There are a number of mechanisms or a number of programs that I think that highlight this commitment and this approach to engaging with civil society. The Gender Equality Fund, which is a $300 million fund, as well as the Women's Voice and Leadership Initiative. They're both great examples of close engagement with partners, as well as and to develop innovative programming and innovative financing mechanisms that deliver core, flexible, predictable funding in support of women's rights organizations and civil society. I'm just watching the time. I see that we're running a little bit late, so I'll just skip ahead to try to conclude. In fact, as I say, the civil society policy that we have and its implementation plan has already put us on course for the DAC recommendation. We look forward to continuing to work with the OECD DAC community of practice on enabling civil society and on the implementation of the recommendation. We know that the DAC recommendation will bring procedures for monitoring and measuring progress. It's a very important part of this process. It's one of the strengths of the recommendation, and we look forward to advancing on this path together. Thank you.
Great, thank you very, very much, Susan. And I couldn't agree more that much of the work that we've done in Canada around a civil society policy and certainly the Feminist International Assistance Policy sets a very powerful framework for synergy with the recommendation. And I'm hoping that I can work with colleagues certainly at Cooperation Canada, but also in the provincial and territorial councils to bring forward some of that synergy, but also to test the recommendation provisions in terms of progress in relating to all of that work. And I do recognize that there are fora that we have already here in Canada with global affairs where that can be possible. So thank you for that intervention. So last but not least, for sure, is a perspective from grassroots organizations in the Philippines. And I call on Carmen to make a presentation.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon also to other who are with us today. Of course, next slide, please. When we look at the governance, which is the exercise of legitimate power, which guides society's function, which enables them to be sustained. Of course, we could always think of the civil society organization as the main player in this, but how far? And if we talk about inclusive governance, it's when national or regional governments enable the input of citizens in decision-making process. It helps increase the trust between the citizen and the government, and it aids in reaching agreements that are supported more widely to achieve more equitable outcomes. Next slide, please. So if you look at inequalities, which it often undermines wider economic growth and improvements in social conditions. Many groups, including women, youth, older persons, ethnic minorities, persons with disabilities, continue to be marginalized from important decision-making processes. And this is very true in the Philippines. And we long for inclusive governance that offers the opportunity for them to be invited for their views and be included. An emphasis on increased representation of all population levels would ensure that the social environment, economic policies are working towards different aspirations. Next slide. So we talk about people's participation, and we want to enable citizens to participate in decision-making, and it opens space for practical and fitting actions. Through the inclusion of knowledge and those who perhaps work in specific areas that are more familiar with the internal processes of that function in society. And it helps us come up with new policies to be compatible with ideas as well. Also with knowledge and skills of citizens in these areas, and therefore, it would produce to be more effective and sustainable. Next. Next slide, please. So the Philippines, the legal framework in the Philippines is very much conducive to citizen participation, as it is supported by the Philippine Constitution. And there are also the local government code that promote participation of civil society in governance. And that code was developed in 1991, and there is also a law on General Appropriation Acts that also support the participation of civil society in the budgeting process. And as of now, there are thousands of non-government organizations that are already engaging with government at the local, at the national and local level, and in the different phases of governance cycle. Next slide. So, the strength of the Philippine CSO lies on the following. Their number. Really, we have thousands, hundreds of thousands of civil society organizations. And majority of them have extensive networking, from the local to the region, to the national, and even at the international level. Their experience and skills from years of development work. You know, development is really it's a very ideal work for Philippines, because we always live in the context of what we call bayanihan, or the camaraderie, or being a very very commune. Like we are very close to the community and we want to help each other. Dedication and creativity of CSO leaders, and flexibility that is linked to small size of most CSOs. Usually we have big CSOs, but they are only composed of 5 people. Could you imagine that? Next slide. So the structure of civil society in the Philippines is, this is how we perceive it. On top are the NGOs, corporate foundation, and national NGOs. These are the rich ones. They are the elite. We also have umbrella organizations, federations, coalition, and networks. And what is are the basic sector or people's organization usually organized based on geographic locations, community-based, such as farmers, fisher folks, older persons, women, and persons with disabilities, older person, and advocates of children. Next slide. So the elite CSOs are the corporate foundation, and they were the ones who are usually in front of international cooperations. There are also professionals, national federation. They have technical expertise, experience with connection, and have the capacity to build strong and sustainable operations based on the requirements of the funding agencies. These are the people who can get as many funding as they want because they have the capacity to respond, and they have and they studied that. They were professionals. And usually they partner with community-based organizations according to their project operational plans and requirements. And they have to screen their beneficiaries for one reason, that they don't want to have problems in terms of accountability. Next slide. We also have those umbrella organizations, networks, coalitions composed of community-based organizations of basic sector professionals or people with common interests or cause. Usually they have loose membership organizations, but can be a strong force in matters commonly agreed upon or may benefit their organizational status. Organizational expertise depends on the quality of representation. Initiatives are usually funded by contribution in cash or in kinds. Like if we want to come up with a position paper, we will call some organization, we will form a loose coalition. And if we need the office, one stable organization will host. They will contribute with staff complements, and the rest will contribute only in numbers. And common initiatives are advocacy, strengthening representation, research, and some capacity building for grassroots members. Oftentimes they have difficulty securing funding. Next slide. So at the last is the grassroots community-based people's organizations, geographically based groups or cooperatives, village associations, municipal, city, provincial federations, composing of basic sectors. In the Philippines, we have 14 basic sectors, and these are really the marginalized sector, and they are concentrated in the community. And they organize because they have a gut feel that if they organize, they can get support because they are really from the grassroots, they are really poor, and they only have each other to depend on. And they just heard that government and some organizations have programs for them, but actually they really don't know how to go about it. Not many of them have legal identity or registered. In the Philippines, you don't have to be registered, but there is a need to register if you want to get support, you want participation in governance process. And common initiatives of grassroots communities are based livelihood. Usually they live by contributing among themselves, and they wait for politicians to notice them so that they can get funding. Actually, there are several fundings available for grassroots CSO, but because they are not trained, they don't have the expertise, they end up not benefiting from the government programs. Next slide. So one of the striking development in the Philippines is the devolution of national services to local government units in the Philippines. Just last year, Executive Order 138 was issued to support implementation of the Supreme Court on the ruling on the share of local government units in international revenue taxes. So the budget of the local government, the villages, the municipalities, and the provinces will increase at least 57%. And with that expected increase in the just share of the national taxes, LGUs are expected to be better equipped to assume the responsibility for delivery of devolved services as prescribed by the local government code. So it's in the law that they have to deliver the services. And it's only now that they will do it. And the executive order in its implementing rules and regulations recognize the crucial role of the CSO in enhancing transparency, accountability, and good governance as partners in pursuit of local autonomy. And some of the role of CSO include providing feedback, pushing for advocacies and initiatives, formulating plans and policy issuances, and implementing capacity development. Next slide. And the devolution of services to local government unit is a major concern for all civil society organizations in the Philippines because of the following. Community-based CSO shall be given the priority to participate in the local development councils and other decision-making bodies. The fact that most grassroots CSO lack the qualifications for accreditation to become members of the local decision-making bodies, their capacity to participate in the planning, budget process, implementation, and monitoring is also a great concern. Lack of capacity means that their concerns may not be included in the plan, and there would be no more alternative to get the services they need, since most of them were supposed to be implemented in the local government units. Next slide. Facts. There is no regular program on supporting the initiatives of individuals to form an organization, association, nonprofit, foundation, or federation, except for cooperatives, because the cooperative is a self-help group. It is mandated by law to have education for organizations who are forming cooperatives. But in cooperatives, every member, they have also a stake. They have a share to pay. And usually grassroots people from the community, if they pay to organize, they will not do it. And the strong grassroots CSOs are composed of strong leaders with support from national or international NGOs who are capable of securing funds from international sources and provide them with capacity building related only to the project being implemented. And grassroots CSO need capacity building in terms of organizational policies, strategic plans, legal identity, and management to qualify for government accreditation requirements, to participate in consultative processes involving matters of importance to them. Next slide. So, And this recent development, especially the devolution of services from the national government to local government unit, has sown fear and uncertainty among local citizens who are very much aware of how local government works and the influence of local officials in some so-called grassroots CSOs. The basic sectors of the community, farmers, fisher folks, victims of disasters, persons with disabilities, children and women in poverty, and older persons may become more marginalized if their representative organizations have no capacities to effectively participate in the development process. Therefore, this is something that development assistance should also look into. And they should include participation of grassroots civil society and enhancing their capacities for effective and meaningful participation. Because I just had one experience when I applied in behalf of one CSO for a disability project with capacity building of women with disabilities. And I was surprised that those people who got very big chunk of funding from Canada, from Canadian and the Canadian Development Cooperation, do not know the meaning of disability support services, so that women with disabilities could participate well in the process. And this is really a very striking experience for me, because this is a very elite NGO and always at the forefront of getting international funding. And I wonder how they were able to secure approval without even knowing what disability support service is. Next slide. Okay. With that, I want to thank you, and I hope that this would be just something to think about. Like, let us face it that civil society from the grassroots are really the majority, and yet they do not get much attention on how we can strengthen their participation so that community-based development will flourish, and there would be more participation from these people who are really in need to be heard and to participate in the planning so that their issues could be addressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carmen. You gave a presentation that really highlights the complexity of civil society in many countries, but particularly in the Philippines, that has a very rich history of civic action by people's organizations and national civil society organizations. And I think it provides a very useful understanding of how we need to situate the implementation of this recommendation in people's experiences of their context in each country. So thank you very much for highlighting all of that, those dimensions in the Philippines. We have about half an hour, in fact, exactly half an hour. There's been a number of questions asked in the question and answer box, about 5 or 6 of them. I also had, as I mentioned, some pre-established questions for the panelists. Given the time, I think what I'm going to try to do is combine the question that I might have asked to the panelists with a couple of questions that have been directed to the various panelists. And I think there, as I said, about 6, but not all 6 to all panelists. So I'm going to just go in the order of the presenters. So first up, Marilyn. You really did highlight the different dimensions of the recommendation very well. But as you know, that this is an audience largely of small and medium-sized organizations So my question to you was to be, you know, how do you think aspects of this recommendation might speak to the situations of small and medium organizations? But in the question and answer, as you've seen, we've had a question around keeping up the political momentum on this, and maybe a few words on that. And a second question about examples, perhaps of flexible funding available to local CSOs, and how in going forward we're able to maybe draw together some of this this practice, perhaps in the toolkit. So, but I urge you to be relatively brief because we have 4 panelists and 4 sets of questions. So thank you. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Brian, and really good questions. Thank you to you and also to participants for these questions. So with regards to the first one on the significance of the recommendation when it comes specifically to SMOs, I just wanted to start by first pointing out that the recommendation doesn't really distinguish large donor country-based or international CSOs from medium or smaller size CSOs in DAC countries or in the global south, but rather it seeks to address how donors can engage more effectively with the civil society sector as a whole when it comes to development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. That said, without specifically targeting SMOs, some provisions obviously have more significance for SMOs than others, particularly local SMOs in partner countries. So I'll point to a few provisions as examples to help illustrate this. Under the second pillar, there are provisions which call on donors to provide support to more diverse and a broader range of civil society actors, and to invest in the local ownership and leadership of local civil society in partner countries, such as by supporting them directly or by ensuring that larger donor-based civil society partners are working with smaller local CSOs. We know from the 2020 OECD study and DAC statistics that the majority of donor funds, approximately 93%, go to large donor or international CSOs and not to smaller or partner country CSOs. In addition, other types of civil society, such as informal civil society actors, traditional forms of civil society, and new civil society foundations, many of which are SMOs, are also not being reached. Thus, the provisions I mentioned would help address these gaps in donor policies and practices, resulting hopefully in more direct engagement with and greater financial support for SMOs. Another provision that I'd like to point to under Pillar 2 calls on donors to streamline their administrative requirements to lower transaction costs and incorporate also adaptive and flexible processes into results management. So for many SMOs, we know that the administrative requirements and transaction costs associated with accessing and reporting on member funding are overly burdensome. Thus, this provision in the recommendation would help ensure a greater number of SMOs are able to meet the requirements needed to receive funding from donors. When it comes to SMOs in partner countries, we know that donors may be unsure of SMOs' capacity to work effectively and transparently to deliver results and be held accountable to their varied stakeholders. So in this sense, one could argue that the entire third pillar, which is essentially about incentivizing CSO effectiveness, transparency, and accountability, is of particular relevance to SMOs in both donor countries and in the global south. And hopefully here too, it could result in greater engagement and support to SMOs. Finally, I'll just flag one last provision before addressing the other questions. So this is in the third pillar, there's a provision which seeks to address the issue of more equitable partnerships between donor country or international CSOs and partner country CSOs they work with. So this provision suggests donors need to examine if these are reciprocal relationships with mutual capacity strengthening, and that appropriately draw from the comparative advantages of the different CSOs they work with, including SMOs in donor countries or smaller local CSOs in partner countries. Many large donor-based or international CSOs often play an intermediary role, and therefore are also encouraged to examine their own relationships with CMOs. So these are just some examples to illustrate how the recommendation can have an impact on the way that donors engage with SMOs. I can now move on to the next two questions, if you allow me.
Just briefly, because we do have the others, yeah.
Yes. So first, and thank you very much, Shatabdi. I hope, yeah, I'm not pronouncing, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So on this important question about how to sustain political momentum around the recommendation, obviously this is, really critical to ensure that, this remains a living document, that it's high on the radar of donors and providers around the world. So I think, first of all, dissemination, of course, is very important. Raising awareness and information in international policy fora with international organizations, but also in dialogues with donor governments, with partner governments, and development partners in developing countries, and also with CSOs. So I think dissemination is critical, but another important aspect is monitoring as well. The whole monitoring process around the recommendation, I believe, will help contribute to sustaining momentum through the DAC peer review mechanism, which invites members to review their development cooperation policies. This will, really put the spotlight on their policies and practices, and will allow them to assess their progress against the various recommendations that they've endorsed, including this one on civil society. And the monitoring process will also help ensure that, the impact and continued relevance of the recommendation going forward over the years. Just to share also that there will be a report in the 5th year that looks at the overall state of play and continued relevance of the recommendation. Maybe just a final point on this to say that CSOs also have a role to play in sustaining momentum, and we hope that we can engage CSOs in supporting the dissemination of this recommendation, but also in engaging when it comes to monitoring by holding their governments, development agencies, and ministries accountable for the successful implementation. So we really hope that CSOs will be engaged as partners with us in sustaining momentum. Just to move on to Maggie's questions around examples of changes when it comes to involving civil society in decision-making processes around funding, and how if there are any examples of changes when it comes to ensuring greater financial support to local CSOs. So from the perspective of the OECD Development Corporation, our role is very much to produce the sort of policy guidance that can help donors change and adapt their policies so that they're more effective going forward. And so the recommendation really does provide a good basis for us now to support donors to implement these provisions in practice. And we will be doing that through the development of toolkits that will enable us to gather examples of good practices and lessons to help donors adapt their policies. So this issue of providing greater support to local CSOs and engaging CSOs around decision-making around funding, we really envisage this as being one of the priorities as an area for a toolkit. So we will have the opportunity going forward to really dive into this issue and to try to gather concrete examples. We know that donors are progressively addressing this issue of localization. Many are struggling in terms of how to, translate these provisions into practice. The issue of providing greater, more direct core support is one of the issues that donors struggle with. And we do know that many donors are actually engaging in a thinking process to try to see how they can take this agenda forward. We have examples from Sweden, the US, Belgium, Switzerland, Ireland, and UK, just to name a few. We know, for example, that the US is envisaging to provide at least a quarter of all their funds directly to local partners within the next 4 years. Switzerland has also launched a learning journey on country leadership with CSOs. Sweden, as part of its learning process around advancing more local support, is advancing thinking around how to shift more direct core support. It commissioned a study recently on risk of corruption, comparing core support or project support, and it concluded that the risk is the same or smaller when it comes to core support to local CSOs. They're also looking at ways to share risks when it comes to engaging with their Swedish CSO partners to invest in partner country CSOs. So this is an ongoing process, and many of the DAC members are exploring options. And from our side at the OECD GCD, as I said, we'll be supporting this learning process through guidance going forward. Many thanks again.
Thank you for those answers. I could add to it, but I won't because time is of the essence. So I want to turn to Anabel, and I realize you've already answered one of the questions that was in the question box, so that was very helpful around support around accountability tools. The question I had for you builds on the importance of equitable partnerships, which, as many have pointed out, is a presumption that lies throughout the recommendation. And I've observed in terms of the monitoring of the Istanbul principles on that aspect, that in that monitoring, we discovered that 75% of CSOs in about 42 developing countries saw their partnerships with Northern CSOs and INGOs as either one-off projects or perhaps longer-term relationships through a series of projects, but really whose direction and content are still largely established by the financing INGO or CSO. And these are hardly conditions for equitable solidarity. I'm wondering if you could speak very briefly on what you see some of the challenges and perhaps opportunities in moving this agenda forward, because as you well know, and I as well, this has been an agenda for perhaps 40 years in civil society development cooperation. So what new can we bring to this to make progress? Not a simple question.
No. Do we have 2 more hours to talk about this? I think one of the provisions that in this recommendation talks about equitable partnerships. And I think that's a very important recognition about that as it is today, partnerships are unequal and there is an unbalanced distribution of power. So it's a recognition of the need to shift power. It's a recognition of the need to localize differently international development cooperation. So it's very important that the recommendation says that big organizations of governments working with partner countries have to pay attention to equitable partnership. And there are many examples, or there are many small steps in practice that this recommendation can be already start to be implemented. We don't have to wait for common monitoring exercises or many years to change some practices, to be aware that we have to change some practices. Before this meeting, I was in a meeting with a big intermediary organization, and we have a project with them, and they have a project with one of the big governments participated in the DAC committee. And the most recent grant that they received, they have lost like 10% of the amount that was agreed last year because of difference in currency is not the same as it was in November or in, so from the very beginning. So who takes the risk? Who takes the responsibility? The burden comes to, in this partnership, comes to the first step, the intermediary organization. And then, of course, as a snowball, it will have repercussions in country projects, in the field projects. So this is a way to, and there are practical examples that where we can start changing our own practices. This is an example, but decision-making processes, leaning, I mean, we have to have leaner administrative processes. So other aspects and indicators are considered, not only this due diligence about administration, which is heavy and it doesn't talk about the results and the effectiveness of the organization. They talk about how good the organizations are in presenting report or in writing report, but not about their work in the field. So many examples and opportunities to change practice in this level. And then this shift power, it's also a call in other levels as well, in terms of organizations working with own constituencies in their country. We are often reproducing these models. So we have to be aware that when we work, a national organization in a certain country works with their constituencies, provide services to vulnerable population, we can, at that moment, also reproduce these unbalanced power relationships. So we have many opportunities to change and to promote change. And I think this recommendation is a very useful tool and can be even more useful if we promote, if we debate, and if we, even if I always say that this is a compact, we can dissecate the different parts and be responsible and work together on this. Thank you. Very brief, because you might have more questions to other panelists, Ryan.
Unmute, sorry. Thank you, Anabel. Yes, I'm just wondering if we could ask the participants to maybe spend maybe 10, 15 minutes longer with this session. I realize people may have other plans, but I'd like to get in the last two panelists and to wrap up, but we'll try to be as brief as we can. So the question next is to Susan from Global Affairs. And actually the question in the question box was very similar to what I was going to ask you anyway. And really to perhaps elaborate a bit on DAC's work and relationships with small and medium organizations and how this recommendation might reinforce aspects of that work. So really 2 or 3 minutes. I know you can't do justice, but I'm sorry, but try to be brief.
All right, thanks very much, Brian. And no, it's true. Even the 2-hour session today still only allows us to scratch the surface, but it does. Today's session did put some spotlight on the collective movement forward on enabling civil society through this recommendation. But there will be many more conversations, I'm sure, about this. And so your question is more about support to small and medium-sized organizations, and that's a question that's top of mind for us, and a lot has been done. And I think a part of the value and the reason that we're looking that we do look to this question of small and medium-sized organizations is that foster that local partnership and tap into different relationships and to different perspectives and to innovation. And the commitment is clear that that there needs to be increased flexibility and transparency and looking to greater effectiveness in how we do deliver our our international assistance programming. Some concrete activities that are happening right now that help to define or shore up the kind of the effectiveness of that approach is, for instance, in call for proposals processes, that there is clarity on consultation in the design of proposals that Canadians are submitting for consideration. And that is, that's sort of the bare minimum. That's just to be in alignment with our actual law, with the Canadian Official Development Assistance Act. The FIAP challenges us to ensure that we've got that there's meaningful engagement of local partners in not just the design, but in the delivery and the monitoring of all of our programming. And so in terms of the processes that are in place that enable this or that affect the reality of how this plays out, there's always a lot of work that can be done, and to ensure that we reach really the most marginalized, the most vulnerable groups in the countries in which we work. There are processes like game changer dialogues and reflections that are looking at processes and really improving the efficiency and the effectiveness of our programming modalities. There's a lot in terms of the other thing that I can maybe say in terms of predictability, because that is an important part, especially for small and medium-sized organizations. And when I speak about the small and medium-sized, I am speaking mostly of the Canadians, but trying to weave in how that relates to local organizations in our partner countries. But in terms of making things easier or more streamlined for our Canadian partner organizations and in their dialogue and their partnerships with other organizations around the world, publishing calendars for calls for proposals so that there's greater visibility on what is coming down the pipeline, and requiring maybe less onerous sort of initial application procedures and working more with concept notes instead of full proposals to help lower the burden. And that's something that we've heard is really quite a useful sort of step. And so these are things that can help in the partnership space where we have Canadian organizations and small and medium-sized organizations are a part of that, working with organizations, with local organizations in partner countries. And because that is where still, the reality is that that's still most of Canada's support to local NGOs, local civil society, is through Canadian partners, through international partners, through multilateral partners. But some of those new and innovative programming mechanisms, like the Gender Equality Fund, like the Women's Voice in Leadership, like even long-standing programs like our Canada Fund for Local Initiatives, allow that direct support to go to Canadian to local organizations and for them to fully lead and be fully accountable for the results and the management of those interventions. So this is
leave it there.
Yeah, sure.
I want to get one more question in. Sorry to cut you off, but
that's okay. No problem. Thanks a lot, Brian.
Very well. So Carmen, just to have the final word with you. As you know, I was going to ask you a question about how some proposals about how to strengthen the role of grassroots organizations in inclusive governance. Given the time, maybe you could just point to one proposal that kind of is indicative of what you would be seeking. I know that's inadequate, but I'm afraid we're quickly running out of minutes here. So if you could just maybe speak to one proposal with regard to grassroots organizations and inclusive governance.
I'm really fond of modeling. So we really have to model a community where we can capacitate grassroots CSOs to participate in local governance, teaching them how to become legitimate members of the local decision-making bodies, and also getting some CSOs to mentor them in organizational policy development, so that they will know that policies, organizational policies, even if you don't register them, is very important, so that there will be order in organization. Because if organization has no policies, they are very easily to be disenfranchised, and especially that local government units look at community-based organization as their extension and not as an independent group. It's really very important to empower this grassroots CSO, so that they would know their rights, and that they are partners and not beneficiaries. They should be participating and not just being given or being served what they don't know, and what they did not, or they should be given what they ask for, and that they work together with a local government, so that they can develop programs for their own groups. Because, like for example, for the groups of persons with disabilities who are really encountering so many barriers in participation, it's very important that they will be given the opportunity to be consulted and to participate in deliberations of matters affecting their development. So we really have to show a model community of grassroots CSOs that are empowered with technical, with the expertise, and giving them the tools and mechanism so that they can claim their rights as participants in development.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And you really do highlight that in developing these tools around the recommendation, we need to really take in multiple perspectives, but clearly the perspectives of grassroots organizations that are sometimes very difficult for us to hear because of many of the structures that limit their inclusion already. So thank you for that reminder. I think we have to wrap up. I'm not going to make a long speech because I probably got a minute, but just to say that I think our conversation today really highlights what this recommendation can provoke. And really that's one of the important aspects of the recommendation initially, is to provoke discussion. Hopefully this discussion leads to change, and real change that's experienced, particularly by local CSOs in their relationship to civil society development cooperation. So I thank the speakers, and I thank you for your patience in terms of the questions and the limited time to put out answers. I'm hoping that we can carry forward this discussion in Canada through OCIC, but maybe also through through Cooperation Canada. And just to say that I also facilitate a working group of civil society at the OECD DAC that is focusing exclusively on the implementation of this recommendation. And so we're trying to draw together the experiences in many of the donor countries and the partner countries around the world. And we want to share that and provoke, obviously, more engagement within this framework, which we see as a very important tool to move this agenda forward. So thank you again, and I really appreciated the richness of this discussion. So over to you, Kimberly, to close us off.
Thank you so much. As everybody said, the time is really flying. So I want to thank everybody for this very rich discussion and exchange. And I want to invite everybody to complete a very short survey that should be popping up on your screen. And while that is happening, I just want to say a few words. So personally, I've learned a great deal today, and I really appreciate learning from the contributors. In particular, I appreciate Brian's primer on the OECD DAC and the broader context of the CSO enabling environment, and in holding the space for us overall under pretty tight time constraints, as it turned out. Marilyn's overview of the pillars of the recommendation, particularly around flexible and predictable funding, strengthening local ownership and capacity of CSOs, and sustaining momentum and holding that momentum for ourselves. To Anabel for your call for voluntary accountability and transparency, particularly one that is rooted in trust, in dynamic relationships, and in dialogue, and in globally recognized good practices, may I say, such as the Istanbul Principles. I just wanted to note that OCIC has been working with the Istanbul Principles for many years, and we use that in a way in our public engagement work. So in the chat, one of our team is going to share a link to Transformation Stories, which is a 5-year photojournalism initiative that we ran with many organizations in its sector to tell the story of global partnership. And we use the Istanbul Principles as an overarching narrative arc. So that might be of interest to some of you. To Susan for highlighting the Civil Society Partnership Policy and Implementation Plan, which is personally close to my heart as I sit on that committee, because it is a very important process and mechanism that is co-created and held by government and civil society together. And Carmen, for your presentation on the context of civil society in the Philippines and the dynamics of the national, regional, and community-led participation, and this recommendation at the end towards modeling and supporting grassroots actors to claim their rights. So brilliant. There's so much to consider and further discuss, and this is just the beginning. So I hope you're all completing the survey. I just want to draw your attention to a few other events happening today and tomorrow as a part of the forum. This afternoon at 2 p.m., we have a panel called Localizing Food Systems that features speakers from Cultural Seeds, Cso International, the Canadian Food Grains Bank, and the Argentinian Food Bank Network. So please click on the link to the website to sign up if you haven't yet. And we hope you will take advantage. Tomorrow morning, we decided to include a yoga session from 8 to 9 a.m. Eastern Standard. So as a special treat for us, these kind of sessions were very much in our head, and we're listening and looking at screens. So we really did want to take that time in the morning to stretch and be together, or in the afternoon, depending where you are in the world. So finally, very sincere thanks to Brian, Carmen, Susan, Marilyn, and Anabel for your wisdom. Special thanks also to Elizabeth, Marilyn, and Eliana from our team at OCIC, and to the interpreters and interpretation support from Ruben, Andre, Roni, from the MCIS Language Solutions. And of course, you all for coming here and joining us for this session, and for your role in moving forward this collective agenda in your areas of work.